Welcome to Cognitive Curves. Today we're exploring a paradox we all know well. Why do so many people enjoy being scared? With insights from neuroscientists, psychologists, and evolutionary biologists, we'll dive deep into why fear is so fascinating and even enjoyable for some. In this unified exploration, we're unpacking everything from sensation-seeking and the amygdala's alarm system to the thrill of facing your fears in a safe space. Get ready for a closer look at the science and psychology that make fear an experience we actively seek out. This episode is a collaboration of experts to provide you with a deeper understanding, and the voice you're hearing represents a unified perspective from our team. So, let's get curious together.
Okay, so let's talk about, something kind of spooky. You ever notice how much people love to be scared? Like we go to haunted houses, watch scary movies. I mean, some people even pay money to get chased by zombies at theme parks. It's like, but fear's supposed to be unpleasant, right? So why do we do that? Why do we like it?
Right.
Today, we're going to take a deep dive into that and try to figure out why we're so into all this spooky stuff. And we're going to be using some research that you, the listeners, have sent in.
Awesome.
Yeah, we've got insights from neuroscientists, we've got psychologists, we even have stuff from evolutionary biologists.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot, but it's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
So, to kick things off, I think it makes sense to start with the basics. You know, why do we even experience fear in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Fear really, when you get down to it, it makes total sense. It's this hardwired response, right?
Yeah.
Thanks to a part of our brain called the amygdala.
The amygdala, okay.
Yeah, and it's basically like our brain's alarm system.
Oh, that's right.
When we sense danger, that amygdala, it triggers that fight or flight response. You know, it's helping us avoid becoming some saber-toothed tiger's dinner way back when.
Right, back in the caveman days.
Yeah, Dr. Joseph Ledoux, actually, he explains this really well in his book, The Emotional Brain.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so that makes sense. Fear kept us alive.
Right.
Helped us survive. But that doesn't really explain, why we would want to stand in line for an hour to go through a haunted house, you know?
Exactly.
With all the fake spiders and the jump scares and all that.
Evolutionarily, it's a bit counterproductive.
Yeah, wouldn't we want to stay away from those things if they signal danger?
Right, and that's where it gets interesting, right?
Yeah.
There's this research by Dr. Marvin Zuckerman, and it kind of sheds some light on this. What he found was that some people are just wired to crave intense experiences.
Oh, okay.
So think about skydiving or eating super spicy food.
Right, or those hot pepper challenges.
Exactly, yeah. Or even a good horror movie.
Yeah.
They're high in what's called sensation seeking.
So it's like a personality trait.
Kind of, yeah. And for these folks, fear, it's just another thrill, you know?
So for some people, it's like their brain is saying, yeah, haunted houses, bring it on.
Exactly.
While others are like, no, thank you. I'll stick with my cozy blanket and a book.
Right.
I think I fall into that second camp for sure. But is there more to it than just, liking intense stuff? I've also heard people talk about horror as being cathartic, like a way to get the fear out, you know?
Oh, for sure. You're onto something there. There's this interesting study by Dr. Glenn Walters, and he actually looked at this with horror movies. And he found that for some people watching these films, it's it's almost like having a good cry.
Oh, interesting.
You know, it's a controlled way to process intense emotions, right?
Yeah.
You're confronting those anxieties,
right.
but without actually being in any real danger.
So it's I don't know, it's like facing your fears, but in a safe space.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, that's pretty cool. But does that, make us less afraid in the long run?
That's a great question. And what's interesting is that it doesn't necessarily reduce our fear, overall.
Oh, okay.
It might help us deal with it in the moment, but it doesn't mean we'll, suddenly become fearless daredevils.
So it's not a cure for fear, but it might help you cope in certain situations.
Right.
You know, speaking of fear, have you ever noticed how, those physical sensations, like your heart racing, the adrenaline rush, sometimes it can almost feel good. Why is that?
That is weird, right?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive.
Well, there's this theory called excitation transfer, and it was developed by Dr. Dolph Zillman. Basically, he says that heightened arousal that you get from fear it doesn't just vanish,
Oh.
It can actually stick around and make any positive emotions you feel afterward even stronger.
Wait, so you're saying like the fear makes the fun afterward even better? That's kind of wild.
Yeah, it's like fear amplifies joy in a way.
Yeah.
And this helps explain why, watching scary movies with friends is often more fun than watching alone.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, because you've got that shared fear and then the relief after and maybe some laughter. It creates this like bonding experience.
Right? You're like, we survived that together.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's like riding a roller coaster with your best friend.
Exactly, yeah.
Terrifying in the moment, but then you get off and you're like, woo, we did it. And you're high-fiving.
Yeah, exactly. That shared experience, it brings you closer.
That makes a lot of sense. But beyond, like, just our bodies reacting, do we have any say in how we actually experience fear? Like, do the stories we tell ourselves about it matter?
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
There's this really prominent psychologist, Lisa Feldman Barrett, and she argues that we don't just, like, passively experience emotions, we actively construct them.
We construct them.
Yeah, and in her book, How Emotions Are Made, she explains that our brains take in all these signals from our body and from the situation, and then they create what we call fear.
So we're not just, like, victims of our emotions. We actually have some control over them.
Exactly. Like, take a haunted house, for example.
Okay.
You know it's not real, right?
Yeah.
Your brain knows it's not real. So instead of feeling pure terror, you can reframe that fear as excitement.
Right.
It becomes a challenge instead of a threat.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like we can choose how we experience fear, even in a situation that's meant to scare us.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's kind of empowering, actually.
It is. It is.
But what about those deeper fears, like the really primal ones that a lot of horror movies tap into? Is there something more going on there, like psychologically?
Yeah, that's a great question. It brings us to Carl Jung, who was really fascinated by the darker side of the human psyche. He had this idea of the shadow self.
The shadow self, okay.
Yeah, and basically it's all the parts of our personality that we kind of like keep hidden.
Yeah.
The stuff we don't want to admit to, even to ourselves.
Oh, okay. So it's like the hidden monster within.
Yeah, you could say that. And by facing these symbolic representations of our fears and horror, we're kind of engaging with those anxieties, right? Maybe even gaining a better understanding of ourselves in the process.
Oh, that's pretty deep. So it's like horror gives us a way to explore those parts of ourselves that we usually keep hidden.
Yeah, exactly.
But is there like a chance that there's actually an evolutionary advantage to all this? Could our enjoyment of horror be some kind of like leftover instinct from our ancestors?
That's a really interesting question. And it's something that evolutionary psychologists like David Buss have explored. His work suggests that, in a real-world survival context, fear is actually crucial.
Right. It keeps you safe?
Yeah, it keeps us vigilant, it helps us learn from danger, and it ultimately increases our chances of survival.
So you're saying our enjoyment of horror could be a kind of practice run for dealing with real-life threats?
Yeah, it's a fascinating possibility, isn't it? Like, horror could be a way for our brains, which are still kind of wired for a world full of dangers, to safely indulge in that ancient survival instinct.
Whoa. That's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It's like our love for scary stories is a legacy from those who came before us.
Exactly.
Okay, but how does all of this tie into the idea of like personal growth? Can facing our fears, even in these fictional settings, actually make us stronger?
That's a great question. To answer that, we need to touch on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a model that describes like human motivation.
Okay.
And at the very top of this hierarchy, there's self-actualization, which is all about reaching your full potential. And guess what often plays a role in that?
What?
Pushing your boundaries, overcoming challenges, and you guessed it, facing your fears.
So by engaging with horror, even though it's scary, we're actually taking a step towards becoming our best self.
Yeah, potentially. It's like fear can be a stepping stone to personal growth.
Wow, that's amazing. But let's be real, not everyone enjoys a good scare, right? Some people just aren't into horror, and that's totally fine.
Oh, absolutely. Our responses to horror are incredibly complex and varied. Personality, past experiences, cultural background, all those things play a role. And when it comes to age, there are some fascinating differences.
Yeah, like you don't see little kids lining up for slasher film marathons.
Right, exactly.
Why is that? Are their brains just wired differently when it comes to fear?
Well, there's this research by Cantor and Oliver, And it highlights some key differences in how children and adults process horror. Kids often find horror genuinely disturbing because they haven't yet developed the cognitive abilities to reframe fear like adults can.
Oh, okay.
They haven't quite grasped that difference between fantasy and reality.
So those scares hit them on a much deeper level.
Exactly.
They don't have that that layer of understanding that allows adults to enjoy the thrill without being truly terrified.
Right.
But even as adults, there's something about sharing a good scare with friends that can be incredibly bonding, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely.
Like, think about screaming and laughing together during a scary movie.
Right.
It's a shared experience that brings people closer.
It is. And there's some research on this, too, by Dr. Norbert Schweitzer. He found that shared fear, especially in settings like haunted houses, can actually trigger the release of endorphins and promote cooperation.
Endorphins, like those feel-good chemicals.
Exactly, yeah. It's like our brains are hardwired to connect with others when we're facing a threat, even if that threat is just a bunch of spooky decorations.
Wow. So even fear can be social glue.
It can.
It's like our brains are saying, hey, we're all in this together. Let's face this spooky stuff as a team.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground already. From our brains wiring for fear to the psychology of sensation seeking to the power of reframing our experiences.
It's a lot, right?
Yeah, it is. And we're just getting started.
Can't wait to dive in even deeper.
Me too. So, on that note, we're going to take a quick pause. When we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into the fascinating world of fear. Stay tuned.
So welcome back to our deep dive into, the psychology of fear. Before the break, we were talking about how these shared scary experiences, how they can actually bring people closer.
Yeah, it's funny how, fear can be so unifying, right? You'd think it'd be isolating, but if you think about those classic horror movie scenes where, the friends huddle together against, some terrifying creature, it's like their bonds are really tested in those moments. Like, they face that danger together, and it creates this, I don't know, this special connection.
Yeah, totally. Like that shared vulnerability that we're in this together thing, it can forge some pretty strong bonds, And this isn't limited to, just fiction either. Think about real life situations like natural disasters or even times of crisis.
Right.
Oftentimes, it's that shared fear and uncertainty that brings communities together.
Yeah.
Helps them get through the tough times.
It's like fear, I don't know, kind of strips away all the superficial stuff, and it forces us to connect on a deeper level.
Yeah, for sure.
But getting back to horror specifically, I've always been curious about why different types of scary stories, why they appeal to different people. Some people love slasher films. Others are all about psychological thrillers. And then you have folks who love ghost stories. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a great observation. And it likely comes down to the specific anxieties that each genre taps into, right?
Oh, okay.
For example, slasher films, they often play on that primal fear of violence, physical harm.
Right.
They kind of trigger that fight or flight response in a very visceral way.
It's like that jump scare, right? Someone jumps out from behind a door and yells "boo!" Not actually dangerous, but your body reacts like it is.
Right, exactly. On the other hand, you've got psychological thrillers, and they tend to focus on more cerebral fears. Things like manipulation, betrayal, loss of control.
It's like they mess with your mind, right?
Yeah, they mess with your sense of reality. Make you question what's real and what's not.
It's like that fear of the unknown, I think, that really gets under people's skin.
It does.
And then there's ghost stories. Those often tap into our fears of death, the afterlife, those big existential questions.
Yeah, the stuff that keeps you up at night.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess each genre provides a different lens through which to explore our anxieties, right?
Yeah, and by engaging with those fears, but in a safe setting, a fictional setting, we might feel a little bit more in control of them, even if it's just for a little while.
It's like a way to test drive your fears, without the real world consequences.
Exactly.
But are there any downsides to this? Could constantly exposing yourself to horror actually make you less sensitive to real life dangers?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there is a potential for desensitization, if we're not careful. Constantly bombarding yourself with graphic violence or disturbing imagery, it could numb you to the emotional impact of those things in real life.
Oh, okay.
So it's all about balance, right?
Right.
Enjoying horror, but not letting it take over.
You know, like you don't want to become so used to the fake blood and guts that you can't recognize like real danger when you see it.
Exactly. Yeah. Got to keep things in perspective.
So it's like enjoy it in moderation, but don't let it become a substitute for dealing with real life issues.
Right. Exactly. And also, it's important to remember that horror isn't for everyone, right?
Right.
Some people are just more sensitive to this kind of content, and that's totally okay.
Yeah.
Like if a horror movie marathon is going to leave you feeling anxious or disturbed, it's totally fine to skip it, you know?
Yeah. It's all about knowing your limits, you know, and choosing what feels right for you.
Exactly, yeah.
Speaking of limits, there's a whole debate about horror and its depictions of, you know, violence and gore. Where do you stand on that?
Oh, that's a tough one. It's a really complex issue. I mean, there are valid concerns about the potential negative effects of too much violence in media, right?
Right.
Some studies, they suggest that exposure to that kind of content, it can increase aggression in certain individuals, particularly folks who are already predisposed to it.
So it's like a trigger for some people.
Yeah, it can be. It can be. But the research on this is ongoing, and it's not like a simple cause and effect thing, you know. Lots of factors influence behavior, and it's impossible to say that like watching horror alone will make someone violent.
Right.
It's more about being aware of the potential risks and making conscious choices about what you consume, especially when it comes to like kids and teenagers, you know.
Right.
They're still developing, still figuring things out.
Yeah, we have a responsibility to be thoughtful about the media we choose, you know, both for ourselves and for younger generations.
Exactly, yeah. It's not about censoring or banning horror, but more about, you know, promoting responsible creation and consumption.
Right.
Horror, like any art form, it can provoke, it can challenge, it can make us think critically. When it's done well, it can be a really valuable experience, you know, even if it scares us along the way.
Yeah, I like that. It's about recognizing both the potential for harm and the potential for good, and using that knowledge to make informed choices.
Exactly, yeah.
On a lighter note, do you have a favorite like horror subgenre or maybe a particular movie that stands out to you?
You know, I'm actually quite drawn to Gothic horror literature.
Oh, okay.
Especially the works of Edgar Allan Poe. There's something so hauntingly beautiful about his writing, the way he creates atmosphere.
Yeah.
The symbolism, the psychological tension, it's masterful.
He's a classic for a reason.
He is. And his themes, they're still so relevant today, you know? Guilt, madness, the fragility of the human psyche.
Yeah, it's timeless. As for me, I kind of have a soft spot for monster movies. Oh, yeah.
Especially the ones that, like, use those creatures as metaphors for our own, you know, fears and anxieties.
That's a great point. Monsters, they often serve as these like projections of our collective fears, right? Whether it's the fear of the unknown, fear of the other, or even the fear of our own like darker impulses.
Right. And by confronting those fears, even in this fictional way, maybe we can learn something about ourselves and the world.
Right, exactly.
It's amazing how these ancient monster myths still hold so much power over us, you know. They tap into something so deep.
They do.
But as we continue to evolve as a species, do you think our fears will change too? Will we develop like new monsters that reflect the anxieties of, I don't know, the 21st century?
That's a fascinating question to ponder. As our world changes, the things we fear are likely to change as well, right?
Right. Like the anxieties of the digital age, the threats of climate change, the uncertainties of this rapidly evolving world. All of these things are like it's shaping our collective consciousness,
right,
influencing the stories we tell. So, yeah, it's definitely possible that we'll see new monsters emerge, creatures that embody our fears of artificial intelligence, environmental collapse, or even like the loss of privacy in this hyper-connected world that we live in.
It's kind of exciting and scary to think about, you know, what will people be afraid of in the future?
Right. It's hard to say, but one thing is certain. The human capacity for fear, it's boundless. And our imagination. It'll always find new ways to express it. But, you know, even though we've talked a lot about like the psychological and social aspects of fear, there's also the physiological side of things.
Right. Like what's actually happening in our bodies when we experience a good scare.
Yeah, like we talked about how our minds make sense of fear, but what about the physical stuff?
Yeah.
You know, the racing heart, sweaty palms, that feeling like you're about to jump out of your skin.
Yeah, what's going on there?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting from like a neuroscientific perspective. So when we perceive a threat, our amygdala, that alarm system, it sends out a signal that triggers a whole cascade of responses throughout the body.
So it's like our brain is shouting, danger, danger.
Yeah, and our body goes into full-on survival mode.
Okay.
Heart rate speeds up, breathing gets faster, pupils dilate, blood flow gets redirected to your muscles, stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, they flood your system. All of this is prepping you to either fight off that threat or run away to safety.
Wow, that's amazing how fast our bodies can react.
It is, it is. But then why do those same physical responses sometimes feel good?
Right.
Like exhilarating. You'd think a pounding heart would be terrifying, not enjoyable.
It's like your body is betraying you.
Right. It's weird. Well, it's all about the interplay between our nervous system and those neurochemicals. When we get that rush of adrenaline and other stress hormones, our bodies also release endorphins.
Endorphins, okay.
Yeah. Those are our natural painkillers, those mood boosters.
So it's like even when we're scared, our body is giving us a reward.
Kinda, yeah. And that rush of endorphins can create this like feeling of euphoria.
Oh, okay.
Even in a stressful situation. So it's that combination of fear and excitement that creates this unique, pleasurable sensation for some folks.
It's like our brains are hardwired to find the silver lining, even when we're scared.
Exactly, yeah. But are there any like long-term benefits to experiencing fear in this way? Could it actually make us more resilient, better able to handle stress in our everyday lives?
Good question.
There's some research that suggests that exposure to controlled fear, like in a horror movie or a haunted house, it could have some positive effects, psychologically speaking.
So it's like a form of exposure therapy.
Yeah, you could say that by repeatedly confronting our fears. But in a safe environment, we learn to manage that anxiety. Right? We develop coping mechanisms.
It's like a workout for your emotional resilience. But I'm also curious about like the cultural aspects of fear, you know? Different cultures seem to have like different ways of expressing and experiencing fear, even different types of monsters and folklore that reflect their own unique anxieties.
Yeah, absolutely. Fear might be universal, but how we express and interpret it,
Right.
that's hugely influenced by our cultural background.
It's like some cultures view fear as entertainment, right? Even spiritual growth, while others see it as something to avoid, something to be suppressed.
Exactly, yeah. And these cultural differences, they're reflected in the types of horror stories and folklore that different societies create. It's fascinating, how these beliefs shape our understanding of fear and even the way we perceive the supernatural.
Yeah, it's like how some cultures see ghosts as like malevolent entities, things to be feared. And in other cultures, they're seen as ancestors,
Right.
or guardians.
Right.
But are there any universal fears that seem to transcend those cultural boundaries? Like, are there certain monsters or like archetypes that scare people all over the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. While cultural influences are significant, there are some primal fears that seem to be shared across cultures.
Yeah.
Like fear of the dark, fear of predators, and fear of death.
Right.
These are all deeply rooted in our evolutionary history,
Right.
connected to our basic survival instincts.
It's like those were real threats to our ancestors, right? And those instincts are still with us today.
Exactly, yeah. Like our brains are still programmed to be afraid of those things, even if logically we know they're not lurking in the shadows.
But what about monsters? Are there any universal monster archetypes?
Oh, for sure. Take the vampire, for instance.
Okay.
It pops up in folklore and mythology all over the world.
Wow.
Ancient Mesopotamia, medieval Europe, even modern-day Asia. The details might be different, but the core concept, a creature that preys on the living, representing our fears of death, the unknown, it stays pretty consistent across cultures.
It's like this primal fear of being consumed,
Yeah.
or drained of our life force. It's a pretty powerful image.
It is. It is. And then you've got the werewolf, which often symbolizes the duality of human nature, the struggle between our civilized selves and our more primal instincts.
Right. The werewolf represents that fear of losing control, of that line between humanity and our animalistic impulses.
Yeah, and that definitely resonates across cultures.
For sure. It makes you wonder, though, as we continue to evolve, will our fears change too? Will we create new monsters that embody the anxieties of, I don't know, the 21st century?
That's an interesting question. I mean, as our world changes, so will the things we fear, right? The anxieties of the digital age, the threats of climate change, the uncertainties of this rapidly evolving technological landscape, all of that shaping our collective psyche,
Right.
influencing the stories we tell ourselves about the world. So yeah, it's definitely possible that we'll see these new monsters emerge. creatures that embody our fears of artificial intelligence, environmental collapse, or even the loss of privacy and autonomy in this hyper-connected world that we live in.
It's exciting and a little bit scary to think about. Like, what will people be afraid of in the future?
Right. What will keep them up at night? It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's certain. The human capacity for fear, it's boundless. And our imagination, it's always going to find new ways to express it. But, I think the core function of horror, it will remain the same. To provide that safe space, to explore those fears, to process our anxieties, and ultimately to come out the other side feeling a little bit braver and a little bit more connected to humanity.
That's beautifully put. It's like horror is a constantly evolving mirror, reflecting our changing anxieties and giving us a way to confront those fears and find meaning in the face of the unknown.
Exactly.
And as we continue to learn more about like the human mind and the nature of fear, our appreciation for the complex role that horror plays in our lives, it'll just continue to grow.
For sure.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. We've talked about so much, from the neuroscience of fear to the psychology of horror to, all these cultural and evolutionary aspects.
It's been a real pleasure to dive into this topic with you.
Yeah, me too.
And I hope our listeners have enjoyed this journey into the dark heart of fear.
Yeah.
You know.
Before we wrap things up, I have one final question for you. Given everything we've talked about, what do you think is like the most compelling reason why people actually enjoy being scared?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, there's so many factors, right? Our biology, our psychology, our culture. But if I had to pick one, I'd say it's the power of catharsis.
Catharsis, okay.
Yeah, that feeling of emotional release. That comes from confronting those fears and coming out the other side.
Yeah.
Feeling that sense of mastery and resilience.
So it's like horror gives us a way to purge those negative emotions in a safe way.
Exactly.
And in doing so, maybe we actually become better at coping with real-life challenges.
Yeah, that's a really powerful reminder that even the things that scare us, they can have a positive impact on our lives.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the psychology of fear. But before we go, I want to leave our listener with one final thought to kind of ponder. As you continue to explore the world of horror, whether it's through movies, books, or even real-life experiences, pay attention to your own emotional responses. Mm-hmm. What scares you the most? What themes resonate with you? And what does your attraction to fear actually reveal about you and your place in the world?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, the answers to those questions, they might surprise you. They might lead you to a deeper understanding of yourself, of the human condition. So embrace the darkness, explore your fears, and never stop asking questions.
Welcome back, everyone. We've been on this crazy journey exploring all the reasons why they're drawn to fear. And I think we've uncovered some really fascinating stuff. It's like peeled back the layers of this complex emotion, and we found all this like psychology and biology and evolution all mixed in there.
Yeah, it's amazing how much there is to learn about something as seemingly basic as a good scare. But even with like all this knowledge, there's a part of me that's still kind of baffled.
Really?
Yeah, like why would we willingly put ourselves through something that's designed to make us feel uncomfortable, even terrified? Doesn't that seem kind of, counterintuitive?
Yeah, I get it. It's like logically we should be running away from scary stuff, not seeking it out.
Right, exactly. But then again, humans, we're not always known for being logical creatures, are we?
That's true. That's true. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of what makes fear so fascinating.
Oh, how so?
It's like this paradox, right? This push and pull between like our instincts and our desires.
Yeah.
Fear it's primal, it's essential for survival, but it can also be a source of pleasure.
Right.
Of excitement, even personal growth.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile those two seemingly opposite sides?
Yeah, it's like fear has this weird duality to it. It can be terrifying but also exhilarating, It can be like repulsive but also attractive at the same time. Maybe that's what keeps us coming back for more,
Mm-hmm.
We're drawn to that edge, that boundary between safety and danger, between comfort and discomfort. It's like we're testing ourselves, seeing how much we can handle.
Yeah, we're pushing our limits, exploring the boundaries of our own emotional landscape,
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe, we discover something new about ourselves along the way.
Right.
We learn about our resilience, our courage, our ability to find joy even in the face of fear.
Right.
And we can't forget the social aspect of it all either.
Right, the shared experience.
Sharing a scary experience with others, watching a horror movie with friends, going to a haunted house, it can create a really powerful connection.
For sure. There's something about facing those fears together. It strengthens those bonds, you know?
Yeah.
It's like we're all in this together, you know, we're facing the darkness. And sometimes that shared experience, it leads to laughter, even a sense of relief afterwards.
Right, like fear becomes this shared language, yeah, a way of connecting on a deeper level.
Yeah.
But we also can't overlook the role of imagination in all of this. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, fear, it's a product of our minds, isn't it? It's those stories we tell ourselves, the images that we conjure up. That's what really creates that feeling of fear.
It's true. Our imaginations are so powerful. We can create these whole worlds in our minds filled with, I don't know, with creatures, with scenarios, things that both fascinate and terrify us.
Right. We're the authors of our own fear.
Yeah.
And that, in a way, gives us some agency over it, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We have the power to choose what we focus on, what stories we let into our minds, and how we ultimately interpret those feelings of fear. It's a good reminder that we're not just like passive recipients of fear. We're active participants.
Exactly, yeah.
But, you know, our world's changing so fast these days. Do you think our fears will evolve too? What will the future of fear look like?
It's fascinating to think about, isn't it? As technology keeps advancing, as society changes, as we're faced with new threats, it seems inevitable that the things that frighten us, they'll adapt and evolve too, right? New anxieties will pop up, new ways of expressing and experiencing fear, maybe even new monsters will be born.
What do you think? Will we see these new monsters like rising from the anxieties of the 21st century?
It's certainly possible. I mean, the horror genre itself, it's a reflection of that evolution, right?
Yeah.
It's always adapting. As we push the boundaries of technology, science, even our understanding of the human mind, the possibilities for exploring fear in new ways, they're pretty much endless.
It's exciting and a little bit scary to think about.
It is.
But I think at the end of the day, our fascination with fear, it's a testament to our curiosity, you know? It's a reflection of our willingness to confront the unknown, to explore those dark corners of our minds, and ultimately, to try to understand ourselves and the world around us a little bit better.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to encourage everyone listening to keep exploring this fascinating topic on your own. Keep reading those books, watching those movies, listening to, more podcasts even. And most importantly, just pay attention to your own reactions,
Right.
What scares you, what intrigues you, what gets your heart racing.
Yeah.
The answers, they might surprise you.
They might.
They might give you a deeper understanding of yourself, of the human condition.
So embrace the darkness, explore your fears, and never stop asking questions.
That's right.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, stay curious.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration into the psychology of fear. We hope you gained new perspectives on why fear is as captivating as it is frightening. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe, drop a comment with your thoughts, and let us know what scares or excites you most. And as always, keep that curiosity alive. Until next time on Cognitive Curves.